Well, today on Rare Classic Cars, we're going to talk about one of the most iconic cars in all of automotive history, particularly in the General Motors stable, and that is the 1959 Cadillac. And specifically, we're going to talk often here in this segment about the Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz, which was a very special Cadillac, the top-of-the-line Cadillac convertible for the time. If you wanted the top-of-the-line car with an actual roof, then you'd have to get the Eldorado Seville. But we're going to take a look at the Eldorado Biarritz and talk about the 1959 Cadillacs because aside from the fact that they really represented the supreme development of the fin, these cars had the largest fins that General Motors ever put on any vehicle. There's a lot of history behind this particular design as to why it came into being and how it ended up the way that it actually did. And I'm sure that's exactly what you want to learn from this channel. So we're going to get started. The first thing to understand is that the 59 Cadillacs that were produced were actually not the vehicles that were originally intended for production. Now, take a look at the 58 Cadillac that you see here, and while it's a relatively attractive vehicle, I would say, it's also a little bit pudgy and doughy looking. And particularly if you look at that quarter panel out back, it's just kind of bulbous. The overall surfaces and forms are rather heavy. And if we take a look at this 1958 Cadillac Coupe, you can see that when the roof is added on top of the convertible's body, that it even looks just more, I guess, heavy is the best way to describe it. It's a heavy roof, kind of a chunky design. It's not something that looks like it's light on its feet, if you will. It just looks heavy, although luxurious. Note this is also a top-of-the-line Eldorado Seville Coupe, and you can denote that by those shark skills ahead of the rear wheel, as well as that chrome trim that surrounds the rear wheel and extends back to the bumper. Let's take a quick look at the 1958 Eldorado rear, and you can see that there are indeed some fins out back, but they're relatively muted compared to the 1959 design, and you get more of that kind of pudgy and doughy shape. Now, let's contrast that styling of the 1958 Cadillac that you saw with this 1957 Chrysler 300C, a very handsome, beautiful brute, if you will, vehicle. Now, why am I doing this? Well, it's really these forward-look Chryslers that were introduced in 1957 that spurred General Motors to design the entire 1959 model lineup, and specifically to melt and repour the design that was going to be introduced in that model year. You see, originally GM Design had really put forth a proposal that looked very similar to the 58. So it was just a warmed over 1958 design that they were going to introduce for 1959. And you also have to understand that this was the time in which the current General Motors styling vice president, Harley Earl, who really originated the concept of car design, was approaching retirement age, and he would indeed retire in 1958, and then in 1959, his successor, Bill Mitchell, would take over. Well, Harley Earl was a fan of tons of chrome as well as heavy forms, and that's probably best exemplified by the bedizened 1958 Oldsmobile as well as Buick, that I don't think you could have put any more chrome trim on those cars. Just super heavy-handed, I think awful looking, but some people like them, and to each his or her own. That's absolutely fine. That's what makes the world go round. But you have to say that there is just a overwhelming amount of chrome, for example, on this 1958 Buick Limited. And that really exemplified Harley Earl's taste as well as his style toward the end of his tenure at the top of General Motors design. Now, what happened, though, for the 1959 model year cars was that, as I mentioned, there was an original proposal for the 1959s that resembled warmed-over 1958s, but a group of General Motors designers went down to a Plymouth plant down on Mound Road in Detroit, Michigan in 1957, just as those cars were about to be introduced. And the designers poked their head through the fence, and what they saw was the new forward-look 1957 Plymouths that were in the lot awaiting shipment to the dealers. Now, if you think about the 1957 Plymouth and what it looked like, compared to, as an example, the 58 Oldsmobile, 58 Cadillac, and those vehicles that I just mentioned, you can see an extremely distinct difference in the styling. And the designers who saw the 1957 Plymouths were absolutely gobsmacked by what their eyes could see through the fence. And that was just vehicles that they felt were class leading in terms of styling, and they knew instantaneously that the vehicles that they were designing for the 1959 model year were basically going to be stale and sale-proof, especially when you juxtapose that styling with this very fresh, modern, light roof, overall clean surfacing, and clean body sides with relatively minimal chrome that could be seen on various Chrysler products for 1957. As the tale goes, this group of designers included Chuck Jordan, who would later go on to lead General Motors design, as well as Dave Holes, who would actually design the 1959 Cadillac as well as the 1960 Cadillac. In addition to a number of other General Motors vehicles, he had a significant hand in the 1966 Buick Riviera, for example, the 1970 Monte Carlo, the 1970 and a half Camaro. Dave was just an overall excellent designer. And once this group of designers saw those Plymouths, they went back to GM Design, and a so-called Palace Coup happened. Harley Earl was off in Europe during this time frame and was not able to supervise the design team while he was away. And so under the direction of Bill Mitchell, who was his underling or kind of second in command, the designers went and reworked the entire 1959 model lineup with new proposals based on what they had seen from Chrysler. Now, when Earl came back, apparently he was silent when he saw the new proposals for 2 to 3 days, recognizing, frankly, that his team was right and that the original proposals were going to be sale-proof in showrooms, but that his team had effectively showed him up and kind of, well, let's just say, were insubordinate. They were not following his directions. But to his credit, he let those designs go through and get released for production. The challenge, however, was that this change was taking place very, very late in the game to do a complete melt and repour on all of the sheet metal versus what the designers originally had proposed. And as a result, the 1959 General Motors full-size cars share a ton of components, including in numerous vehicles, roofs, glass, windshields, backlights, front glass, rear glass, and even door sheet metal. The door sheet metal is patterned off of the Buick design for all cars. I should say the front doors are the exact same on all of the cars. And a lot of the inner black metal, or the sheet metal that you can't see, and the floor pans are also identical. So those 59 General Motors full-size vehicles, despite looking quite different in the front clips as well as the rear, have a ton of shared components, and that was done not only to save money but to save time, because these designs had to get to market much more quickly than what was originally anticipated because of that so-called Palace Coup. Now, I mentioned that the lead designer for the 1959 Cadillac was a man by the name of Dave Holes, and Dave had worked on Cadillacs for a number of years. He would subsequently go on to lead Buick Studio for a number of years in the 1960s. But he was the one who was responsible for penning this supreme development of the Fin, the 1959 Cadillac. And frankly, Dave, though now deceased, in interviews, spoke about how he was actually embarrassed by the overall design. He personally preferred his 1960 Cadillac design, which I actually think is also more tasteful, over the 1959, which he thought was overdone. So why then did they go with these huge fins in 1959? Well, remember, Cadillac had introduced, or at least they felt that they introduced, the rear fins to the public with the introduction of the 1948 Cadillac. And so you couldn't have a company like Chrysler outfin Cadillac. It just wasn't something that they were going to allow to happen. And so for 1 year, Cadillac had these super tall tail fins on the rear, and that year was 1959. And as we look at the rear of this 1959 Eldorado Biarritz, the top-of-the-line convertible for Cadillac for 1959, you can see those dramatic tail fins. Obviously, the tail lights there had some inspiration from rocket forms, which is not surprising. Remember, this was the rocket era, and you had a lot of that space theme that was not just displayed in cars, but a lot of different things from the time as well, too. Now, the top of the line convertible, the Eldorado Biarritz, and the top of the line, let's say, hardtop, the Eldorado Seville, both had the same base price, $7,400 back in 1959. And that's the equivalent of about $80,000 in today's terms. So very expensive cars for the time. But you did get them very well equipped. They came standard with power seats, power windows, power locks, radio, heater, and you even got a 3.2-barrel 345 horsepower version of the Cadillac 390 cubic inch V8. That came standard with a 4-barrel in the other lesser Cadillacs, although you could option up for about $120 to that 3.2-barrel setup. It was rarely done. So you did get some really, I would say, good content for the money. And of course, you got the little extra chrome trim, that piece of chrome that runs down the side here that you can see. That was something that came on the Eldorados. Unfortunately, you also got an extremely troublesome air suspension setup that came standard in the Eldorados. And this really replaced the coil springs on the underside of the car with air bladders. And the system was notoriously unreliable. And many people felt it just didn't provide a better ride than the regular coil springs. And I believe all the systems were recalled. Part of the problem here was that moisture would get into the system, and then it had no way to escape. And of course, as you're trying to pump up the rear or the front or keep it pressurized, you have to have a compressor. And one of the things that doesn't compress is water. Water does not compress, only air or gas does. And so the whole setup just was rather faulty. And as a consequence, many General Motors vehicles that were optioned with that air suspension had them retrofitted. And that air suspension was not just something that you could get in the Cadillacs, it was optional in other General Motors vehicles, Oldsmobiles and Buicks as well. So they all had these same problems, but it was standard equipment on the Eldorados. Now, in addition to the fins, there's a number of cool elements of the design of the 1959 Cadillac, including those reverse lights with the V's. But also take a look at that trim panel in between the bumper sections, and then contrast that with the front of this 1959 Cadillac that you see here. The front theme is clearly repeated in the rear, that grille texture. And I have to say, I guess the front of the 1959 Cadillac is not something that I'm particularly enamored with. The lower portion of the bumper still looks rather heavy to me, although certainly less heavy than previous models. And I don't know if I care necessarily for the bisected grille look that the car has, but it's still a good-looking vehicle overall and handsome. Now, the upper-end Eldorados really didn't sell all that well, probably due to their base price. The Biarritz, or the convertible, sold around 1,200 units, and I want to say the Seville sold around 800 or 900 units. So they are very, very rare today and prized among collectors who really enjoy the supreme development of the fin years from Cadillac. As we take a look on the inside of the car, notice that this Eldorado Biarritz has the bucket seats, and this was something that was standard on the Eldorado Biarritz. Very rare. Remember, this was the time of bench seats in many vehicles, but when you got this, you got these bucket seats. And, well, they look kind of handsome, at least, and overall, very luxurious leather trim. And you also got some very expensive trim on the dash as well as the door panels. Notice here, this has an aftermarket air conditioner. I think it's called a Frigiking aftermarket air conditioner, which, was pretty popular during the time, these aftermarket air conditioners. And I guess the original owner thought that for his or her convertible, it just didn't need air conditioning, and then somebody put it in later on. Well, this is a very vintage setup. You'll notice this car also has the electronic dimming headlamps. You can see that little pod at the top of the center of the dash. That's what that's for. It's an electronic eye that senses oncoming headlamps and then will dim the headlights from their bright light setting to the low setting automatically, so you don't need to do it. And as I mentioned, this car came standard with power windows here. That also has a 3-position wiper as well as washer, all in this one control on the driver's side. That wiper control in subsequent years would actually turn into a cruise control setup where the wash button would become the set button for the cruise. And that confused some Cadillac owners because they were used to turning the wipers on this way, but the wiper control had moved to the dash by that period of time. Turning under hood, we have Cadillac's 390 cubic inch V8. Cadillac had introduced their overhead valve V8 in the 1949 model year, and by this point it was 390 cubic inches, and as I mentioned, was outfitted with 3 2-barrel carburetors as standard equipment in the Eldorados that made 345 horsepower. Came standard with a 4-barrel carburetor in the lesser Cadillacs that made 325 horsepower. You can also see the aftermarket 2-piston compressor here for the air conditioning that I was describing before. And there would have been another compressor on the driver's side for that air suspension setup. It appears to be long since gone. Not surprising given all the issues that I mentioned associated with that air setup, that this was probably retrofitted way, way, way back when. Car also has an oil filter. See that little canister on the driver's side? That was standard in the Eldorados as well. Oil filters during this time frame were just coming into vogue and still relatively novel, but you got to protect your investment, your expensive Cadillac. And so this Cadillac came standard, as I mentioned, with an oil filter. If we take a look at this picture from the brochure, you can see that these Cadillacs had an X-frame. This was pretty popular during the time frame. The thought was that these frames could be relatively light and also relatively strong. Of course, they didn't have great side impact protection, and so they would basically go out from the picture. I think the latest General Motors car to use the X-frame might have been the 1970 Riviera. And, well, after that, they were gone because of those side impact standards and safety overall. But nonetheless, this 1959 Cadillac, as well as others in the General Motors lineup, employed this X-frame, and it gave a good ride overall. Now, for 1959, all Cadillacs, except for the factory-produced Series 75 limousine, rode atop 130-inch wheelbase, and interestingly, they were 225 inches in overall length. Yes, 225 inches, and that is where the Buick Deuce and a Quarter Electra 225 derived its name, because the Electra 225s were 225 inches long. But at this point, the Cadillacs were 225 inches long, so you could call your 1959 Cadillac a Deuce and a Quarter, I suppose. Hope you enjoyed this story of the 1959 Cadillac. If you did, be sure to drop a comment in the comments section. What was most interesting to you? And like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks again for watching.